Imagine a place among sand dunes and dry hills, where in the summer the sand heats up to 70 degrees Celsius, and it might not rain for months. There are no big rivers, no lakes, and almost none of what people usually associate with fish farming. Anyone would say that it's tough to grow even weeds in conditions like these. But right now, in the middle of this heat, thousands of tons of fish are swimming in huge pools. They are fed, sorted, sent for processing, and delivered to stores. But how is something like that even possible? And who came up with it? The very idea sounds like something out of science fiction. However, we're talking about a very real project in Israel that has been running for many years in the Negev Desert. But how did a country used to saving literally every drop of water arrive at such a solution? And the deeper you start to dig into this story, the more you realize that the secret wasn't hidden in the sea, or in the rivers, or even in future technologies. It was deep underground the whole time, a place where no one even thought to look. If you look at a map of Israel, you'll see that the Negev Desert takes up almost half of the country's territory. From the air, it looks like an endless expanse of rock, sand, and sun-scorched plateaus. In some areas, there is so little rainfall that any patch of green looks almost like an accident. Many travelers who find themselves here for the first time describe the same feeling. It seems as if the landscape itself is constantly reminding you of the lack of water. At the same time, the country's population continued to grow for decades. People needed to be provided with food. They needed vegetables, fruits, dairy products, meat, and fish. For a small nation, depending on imports always means additional risks. This is especially true when it comes to products that need to be on store shelves regularly, regardless of the global situation. That's why back in the country's first few decades, engineers and agronomists began to treat water completely differently. Where others saw it as a common resource, they had to see it as a strategic factor. Acre. Every new well was studied with special care. Every reservoir was planned for years ahead. Over time, this approach became part of the national culture of resource management. Later, Israel learned to desalinate seawater on an industrial scale, reuse treated wastewater, and create agricultural projects in areas that were previously considered hopeless. Many of their solutions surprised experts from other countries. But even against this backdrop, fish farming remained one of the most difficult challenges. Fish are almost always associated with large amounts of water. When a person hears the phrase fish farm, they usually picture ponds, lakes, or stretches of coastline. This image seems so natural that it rarely raises any questions. That's precisely why the very idea of raising fish in the middle of a desert was for a long time seen as something completely illogical. Even among experts, there were plenty of skeptics. The logic seemed simple. If water is scarce, why waste it on fish when there are more obvious agricultural pursuits? A few decades ago, a question like that seemed perfectly reasonable. But the problem was that beneath the surface of the Negev Desert lay a resource that for a long time, almost no one took seriously. Deep underground, there are ancient aquifers. This water has been accumulating here for a very long time, and its properties are noticeably different from typical fresh water. It contains a large amount of salts and various minerals. This water isn't very suitable for drinking. It also creates serious difficulties for many crops. For a long time, it was seen more as a problem than a useful resource. However, researchers gradually noticed an interesting pattern. Some species of fish are able to live in water with high mineralization much better than previously thought. What's more, certain parameters of such an environment turned out to be quite comfortable for particular species. What at first looked like a limitation unexpectedly began to turn into an opportunity. When I first stumbled upon a description of these projects, I assumed it was about a small experiment, a few pools, a couple of research groups, and cautious attempts to test an unusual idea in practice. But the more material I came across, the clearer it became that the story was on a much larger scale. The first fish farms really did start out on a pretty small scale. Water was pumped up from deep wells, fed into specially prepared pools, and then fish were introduced. From the outside, the picture looked almost surreal. A dry desert stretched all around, and right next to it was a facility that would have looked much more at home near the seacoast. But the real question wasn't whether the fish could survive for a few months. It was much more important to figure out if it was possible to create a system that would work for years. A one-off experiment and stable production, those are two completely different challenges. It was at this stage that the most serious trials began. Many early projects involved constant checks and adjustments. Researchers had to figure out which fish species grew fastest in the local water, which could better tolerate changes in chemical composition, and which were economically viable to raise. A mistake could mean losing an entire season. That's why every decision was checked especially carefully. The water was pumped from a great depth, where the temperature remained relatively stable throughout the year. This unexpectedly turned out to be a major advantage. In regular bodies of water, farmers often deal with sharp temperature swings. Here, part of that problem disappeared on its own, thanks to the nature of the underground aquifers. For many fish species, environmental stability is incredibly important. Sudden temperature changes cause stress, affect growth, and can increase the risk of disease. So, the consistency of the conditions turned out to be just as important a factor as the chemical composition of the water itself. But along with the advantages came new challenges. The water mineralization required constant monitoring. Some substances were present in safe concentrations, while others had to be tracked almost continuously. Any error in the calculations could lead to serious losses. The larger the farms became, the higher the cost of such miscalculations. Gradually, a whole technological infrastructure began to form around the pools. Monitoring systems, automatic sensors, pumping stations, and water purification equipment started to appear. A modern fish farmer looked less and less like a guy with a fishing rod by a pond. In many cases, his job was closer to managing a complex industrial facility. Special attention was paid to the oxygen content. Fish consume it constantly, and at high water temperatures, maintaining the right balance becomes more difficult. That's why compressors and aeration systems ran almost nonstop. Too much depended on their reliability. A serious failure was all it took for the consequences to become noticeable within just a few hours. If you approach a farm like this early in the morning, the first impression is quite unusual. A light haze hangs over the pools. You can hear the steady hum of equipment, and all around stretches a dry landscape with almost no signs of life. The contrast between the technological facility and the surrounding desert looks especially strange. It seems like these two worlds shouldn't even exist side by side. But this is exactly the kind of scene that gradually became common in certain parts of the Negev. As they gained more experience, specialists got a better understanding of which fish species were suitable for these kinds of conditions. Some showed good results in the early stages, but turned out to be too sensitive to environmental changes. Others grew more slowly, but tolerated fluctuations in water parameters better. Each farm was essentially collecting its own data, comparing results season after season. Over time, the selection of the most suitable species became more and more clear. Certain marine species were of particular interest. At first glance, the very idea sounds paradoxical. Saltwater fish are usually associated with the coast, ports, and salty bays. However, the mineralized water from deep underground aquifers, in some cases, created conditions similar to what these species were adapted to in the wild. For many observers, this particular point became the most surprising part of the whole story. Gradually, the engineers began to understand that they were not just working with pools and fish. They were dealing with a system where almost every parameter influenced the final outcome. The water circulation speed, the density of the fish speed, the density of the fish population, the oxygen supply schedule, the feeding routine, and dozens of other factors were all interconnected. Changing one element often had a ripple effect on the entire farm's operation. Interestingly, around the same years, other arid regions of the world were trying to solve similar problems. Some were building new canals, some were searching for additional sources of fresh water, and others were experimenting with artificial reservoirs. But in the Negev, the path turned out to be a little different. Here, the main focus was not on finding new volumes of water, but on making the most efficient use of the resources they already had. This approach required a completely different way of thinking. Instead of the question, where can we get more water, another question was being asked more and more often. How can we get the most benefit out of every cubic meter that the farm already has at its disposal? It was this logic that gradually began to influence the future development of the fish farms and prepared the ground for the next important stage. Over time, the farm owners faced a new challenge. Even if the fish were growing successfully, what should be done with the water after a growing cycle was complete? Simply dumping it meant losing a valuable resource. This was especially true in a region where the cost of water is measured not just in money, but also in the enormous effort required to obtain it. This is precisely where the story of fish farms starts to go beyond ordinary fish farming. It turned out that after being used in the tanks, the water doesn't necessarily become useless. It retains substances that, with the right approach, can be used further. What looks like waste in one process can become a resource in another. Some farms began to combine fish farming with growing agricultural crops. The water from the tanks was reused, helping to provide plants with moisture and some of the necessary nutrients. This approach allowed for additional benefits without increasing water consumption. Gradually, such systems came to be seen as one of the promising directions for development. This created a kind of chain where one process followed another. First, the water was involved in raising fish. Then, it was used to handle additional tasks. Because of this, every bit of water pumped from a deep well brought more benefit than with a traditional setup. For an arid region, this kind of efficiency was incredibly important. On the surface, solutions like these might seem like technical details. However, a project's viability is often built on these very details. A single clever engineering solution rarely changes the situation on its own. What proves to be far more important is the combination of dozens of small improvements that gradually make the system more reliable, cheaper, and more sustainable. With each passing year, the farms became more and more technologically advanced. Filtration systems improved, water quality control methods were perfected, and energy losses were reduced. Many processes that once required constant human involvement were gradually automated. This not only helped to increase efficiency, but also allowed for a quicker response to potential problems. All the while, the desert itself was a constant reminder of its unique challenges. Sandstorms could knock out the equipment. High temperatures put extra strain on the pumps and cooling systems. Any breakdown required quick action, because living organisms can't wait a few days for repairs to be completed. That's why the reliability of the technology gradually became one of the key factors for success. Plenty of difficulties also arose during the early stages of operation. Some materials wore out faster than expected due to the water's composition. Certain technical solutions worked well in theory, but showed completely different results under real-world conditions. Therefore, a significant part of the accumulated experience came not from successes, but from correcting mistakes. If you read reports from different years, it becomes noticeable how rarely development went according to a preconceived plan. Researchers often had to reconsider their own assumptions. Sometimes a problem was discovered where no one expected to see it. Sometimes, on the contrary, potentially dangerous factors turned out to be less serious than originally thought. This is exactly how the practical knowledge base was gradually formed. For this reason, modern farms look much more confident than their early predecessors. Behind every fine-tuned procedure are years of observation, calculations, and experiments. Many solutions that seem obvious today once had to be found literally by trial and error. It was this path that made it possible to turn an unusual idea into a working system. By that point, the farms had already ceased to be a laboratory experiment. Now they had to solve a different problem. It's much easier to raise fish than to sell them on the market at a competitive price. The customer doesn't care how unusual the growing conditions were. They care about the product's quality, its cost, and the stability of the supply. So, the farm owners had to think not only about biology and engineering, but also about logistics. At first glance, transporting fish from the desert seems like a minor detail compared to drawing water from deep underground aquifers. However, it's precisely at stages like these that unexpected costs often pop up. The product has to be delivered quickly to processors, the right temperature must be maintained, and delays must be avoided. The farther the farm is from major transportation routes, the more crucial the organization of the entire supply chain becomes. The climate brought additional complications. In the summer, air temperatures in some parts of the Negev rise to levels where any equipment starts to work under increased strain. Pumps, compressors, and control systems have to operate almost continuously. While in regular farming, some problems can be put off, in fish farming, that option often just isn't there. In fish farming, the operation of the equipment that supplied oxygen was especially critical. Fish can tolerate many changes in conditions much better than a sharp drop in the water's oxygen content. That's why even brief failures required immediate intervention. For this reason, many farms gradually acquired backup power systems and additional protective mechanisms. Over time, it became clear that the main asset of these kinds of farms was not in the pools or even in the wells. The most valuable resource turned out to be the accumulated experience. A new well can be drilled. New equipment can be bought. But the knowledge of how the entire system behaves in real desert conditions is impossible to gain without many years of hands-on work. But even when the technology started to work, a new question came up. They had learned how to raise the fish. Now, they had to sell them. And here, the farm owners ran into an unexpected problem. Many customers simply did not believe that the fish had actually been raised in the desert. To people, it sounded so unusual that they had to literally explain where the product came from. It wasn't just the buyers who were skeptical. Some experts were also pretty cautious about the projects. On paper, everything looked great. But it's one thing to show results for a year, and a whole other thing to keep production going for decades. That's why the first farms were basically under constant observation. A lot of people were just waiting for the moment the system would show its weak spots. But the most unusual part wasn't even the fish farming itself. In some parts of the Negev, the groundwater contains so much salt that its composition is closer to seawater than to regular freshwater. This is precisely why certain farms were able to raise species that people were used to associating exclusively with the coast. In fact, some of the fish spent their entire lives hundreds of kilometers from the sea without ever seeing it once. Not many people know that another industry grew in the Negev right alongside the fish farms. This was the business of raising ornamental aquarium fish for export. The same wells, the same mineralized water, but a completely different market. Guppies, swordtails, cichlids, and dozens of exotic species are raised in open-air pools. Then the fish are sent by plane to pet stores in Europe. For many farms, this niche industry turned out to be more appealing than selling fish for the dinner table, since ornamental fish are sold individually and cost incomparably more than their weight. The farm's relationship with birds turned into a whole other story, pretty much unrelated to the water issue. The open pools in the middle of the desert became a rare source of easy pickings for migratory cormorants, herons, and pelicans. These birds make a stopover in the Negev on their way from Africa to Europe. For the farms, this turned into a constant war. Nets over the pools, acoustic scarers, and staff on duty at dawn. Ornithologists saw the same situation differently. The farms had accidentally created artificial watering holes, where it was previously physically impossible for the birds to stop. Some migration routes began to shift specifically because of this. A separate line of development had to do with genetics. After several generations of breeding in saltwater, specialists noticed that fry from local fish lines tolerated mineralization, noticeably better than individuals freshly brought in from the coast. This sparked the idea of selective breeding, to select for breeding stock not just large and healthy fish, but those whose offspring consistently adapt better to the water composition of that specific well. This is how some farms develop their own, essentially homegrown, lines of fish. Fish like this don't exist anywhere else in the world. Diseases were a subject the farms preferred not to discuss publicly. A closed tank with a high fish density, it's a perfect environment for infection to spread rapidly. A single introduced pathogen could wipe out a farm in a matter of days. So, over time, strict biosecurity protocols were developed. A quarantine for new batches of fry, separate clothes and shoes for each tank, a ban on moving equipment between sections. This kind of discipline might seem excessive to an outsider, but it's precisely what separates a farm that operates for a decade from one that closes down after the very first outbreak. The sun, the desert's main enemy in summer, eventually became its resource as well. Some farms switched to solar panels to power their pumps and compressors. This was not about ecology, but pure calculation. Diesel fuel had to be brought in from far away, while the Negev has an abundance of sun year-round. The result was an almost ironic picture. The equipment that saves the fish from the water overheating is itself powered by the energy of the very sun that heats the water up. Over time, the competition for groundwater gave rise to a less pleasant side of the story. The wells that supply the fish farms are also needed by the farmers growing dates and vegetables. and by the Bedouin communities in the south of the country. The allocation of water quotas periodically became a source of tension between the different groups of users of the same limited resource. In this sense, the fish farms were not an isolated technical success. They became part of an already existing and not always peaceful dispute over who gets how much water. A major twist came when it turned out that Israel's main export in this area wasn't the fish itself, but the know-how they'd built up. Companies that grew out of the experience of the Negev farms began selling turnkey technologies for closed-loop recirculation systems internationally, to countries in the Persian Gulf, to Southeast Asia, and even to North America. It was a rare case of decades of trial and error in one specific patch of desert being turned into a full-fledged product, one that could be packaged and sold as a complete deal, complete with engineers, blueprints, and years of data on equipment failures. Climate change threw its own curveball into the mix. Rising average temperatures put more strain on the cooling systems and made the summer months even riskier for the equipment. At the same time, for several warm water fish species, the warming groundwater actually turned out to be a blessing, speeding up their growth and shortening the production cycle. Farms that just recently fought the heat as if it were a pure evil have gradually learned to use certain aspects of it to their advantage. It's also interesting how the attitude of insurance companies and banks toward such projects has changed. In the beginning, not a single financial institution understood how to assess the risks of such an operation. After all, it depends on the stability of an ancient aquifer, the corrosion rate of pipes in salt water, and the whims of migratory birds, all at the same time. Years later, specialized assessment methods specifically for desert aquaculture emerged, developed based on many years of statistics on accidents and insurance claims, specifically in the Negev. The industry itself essentially created its own financial language to describe its risks. Today, if you add up the ornamental fish, the farms, the technology exports, and the secondary agricultural projects using recycled water, it all amounts to a significant part of an entire region's economy. Half a century ago, this region was considered practically lifeless. The desert hasn't stopped being a desert, the heat hasn't gotten any better, and there isn't any more water. It's just that over decades of hard, not always successful work, people learned how to get value from a resource that seemed useless, something nobody even thought about half a century ago. And probably the most unexpected thing about this story is that it has no end. Every year brings a new type of fish, a new breeding line, a new country where Israeli equipment is sent. The Negev Desert hasn't turned into a sea, and it's not about to. But it has learned to live as if something far more valuable than it seems, at first glance, is flowing beneath its sand.